Good evening and welcome to Trump in Asia, a More Dangerous Place, a La Trobe Asia webinar. I am Beck Strading, the Executive Director of La Trobe Asia at La Trobe University in Melbourne. I would like to begin this event by acknowledging the elders of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which La Trobe University sits. And I would like to pay my respects to their people, both past and present, and extend that respect to other Indigenous Australians who are watching this webinar. So part of our role at La Trobe Asia is to engage the public on meaningful debate and discussion and to deepen our understanding and knowledge of the Asian region. And tonight I'm particularly honoured to launch La Trobe Asia's fourth policy brief, which has been produced, edited and designed by our fabulous digital communications producer, Matt Smith. And this policy brief, titled A More Dangerous Place, features 8 opinion pieces from well-renowned experts from across the region and is a retrospective of US-Asia relations during the past 3.5 years of the Trump administration. So how has the relationship between the United States and Asia fared under the leadership of Donald Trump? Has the political environment in Asia become more uncertain? Has it become more dangerous, as our title suggests? Will the situation improve in the future? What will it mean for the balance of power in the region if the situation doesn't improve? So here with me tonight to launch our policy brief and to discuss these vital regional issues is our terrific panel. So first, I would like to introduce Professor Jia Daozhang, who is zooming in tonight from Beijing. He is a Professor of International Political Economy at the School of International Studies at Peking University and is an expert on non-traditional security threats in Asia. And I'm really delighted to have you here, Daozhang, not just for presenting at this webinar, but for also contributing to the policy brief and giving us your insights on the economic relations between US China under Trump. So thank you again for those contributions. Our second guest this evening is Associate Professor Nicole Curato, who joins us from the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra. Nicole is an expert on deliberative democracy, social theory and political participation. So I'd like to welcome you, Nicole, coming to us from Canberra, and also to thank you for the contribution that you made to the policy brief, looking at the Trump administration's impact on politics in the Philippines. So welcome, Nicole. And finally, our third guest is Dr. Huang Litu, also zooming in from our nation's capital of Canberra. Huang is a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute in the Defence and Strategy program, where she researches issues of Asian regional security with a particular focus on Southeast Asia and relations between China and Southeast Asia. And so I'm again thrilled that you are able to join us tonight and that you are able to write a piece for us for the policy brief on US-Vietnam relations during the era of Trump. So welcome. There will be an opportunity for audience Q&A in the second half of this webinar, for which we will be using Slido. So please do go to slido.com and enter the code A531, and you can see we have prepared earlier a background with the code. So you will be able to ask questions on Slido, which everybody will be able to see as the discussion is taking place. You can also vote on questions that other people have asked, which I would really like to encourage you to do because it pushes the most popular questions to the front of the line. If you are having difficulties with Slido, but would like to ask a question, please feel free to email the La Trobe Asia team at asia@latrobe.edu.au, and they will be able to type the question in for you. But let's get started. And I would like to first take the discussion to you, Daojun. I want to ask you about the nature of the relationship between China and the United States under Trump, because, you know, over the last 3 or so years, there's been a fair bit of drama, high drama in the economic relationship. We've seen so-called trade wars, we've seen tit-for-tat trade sanctions, we've seen disputes over international rules and institutions, you know, the World Trade Organization as an example. And you argue in your piece, this is something that I found really interesting about your piece, that this is less a pivotal moment of decoupling, as it's been widely described in analysis, than one of deflating established expectations. So I really want to get your thoughts about what you mean about these sort of taken for granted assumptions about the direction of US-China economic relations. Has that kind of misled us into thinking that these relations would continue between the two states?
Well, thank you for having me. I benefited from the previous work in preparing for the publication, and also you and your colleagues did a great job bringing my writing up to the level of publication. So I'm happy to be here. But in terms of your question, I think this is probably one of the most critical knots that you can call it a blockage point in the blood veil when we think about if we compare US-China relation to the body. We can have a zombie, we can have a 70-year-old body, we can have a more dynamic body. But the blockage point is that on the US side, and also not just US, it's analytically in larger parts of the world, you have this idea of a trade-off. That is to say, the US opens to trade with China, and in return, China would reform its political system in the US image. But on the Chinese side, there was never that sort of trade point. We don't, trade is trade. We sell products to the US, we negotiate a price. The US has nothing to do with socialism or communism or speaking a word of Chinese language. So a good deal of US frustration that goes way before Trump, way beyond Trump, is that somehow the Chinese owe us. Somehow China's success is made in America's backyard. And you have this pervasive sense of indignation, or you have this sense of righteousness to say, quote unquote, to lecture China. And that's met with a very, may not be that lively, but a very real and very strong sense of resistance. I wouldn't think there would be a difference if, let's say, the political party here in China, where it came to power through elections, or the political party here in China had a different name. And it's sort of like, you know, we have 2 colleagues, one from the Philippines, one from Vietnam, right? It's sort of like for hundreds or thousands of years, we dealt with our neighbors. They could say come in to say hello, or some say it was a tributary, but we never said, well, there was a trade-off. So long as you were trading with China, you become more Chinese. We would force you, or else we cut you off, or we place conditions. So, but the real challenge, I would think, is what happens when the current pattern of interactions sort of contentious. It's going to last way beyond Trump. Whoever becomes next US president is going to be, let's say, at least one or more US presidencies to come. The real test will be, let's say, 10 or 15 years from today. China still is as defiant as it is. And being a continental economy, it actually grows fairly well. What does the US say? And what kind of, let's say, elevated agitation, a sense of agitation would come? And how do we manage that? And likewise, can the Chinese continue to insist that we have been so thousands of years, just leave us alone? Is that an option? So I think the real challenge is going to come 10 or 15 years down the road. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to sort of, encourage you to tell us a little bit more about those challenges, because, thinking from an Australian perspective, there are already quite a lot of, there's quite a frosty relationship with between Australia and China right at the moment. You yourself, Daozhong, have strong connections with Australia and with Australians. So I wouldn't mind if you could tell us a bit more about how you think that the uncertainty or the unpredictability of the Trump administration has altered China's approaches or policies to Australia in particular, but also to the region more broadly considered.
I will be trying to be careful because the public discourse environment on international affairs in Australia is getting, let's say, interesting. I speak only for myself. It's really a great puzzle why geopolitical relationships between China and Australia has to be this contentious. You see, we are separated by huge oceans, unlike Japan, that is also a close American ally, or Korea for that matter. China and Australia never had much of a real historical entanglement. And it is true that some analysts, or probably some officials here in China, were a bit opportunistic in relating to Australia by way before this, way before the, let's say, even Kevin Rudd's administration. They were painting Australia as a little more than an appendix to the United States. That really is a reflection of, should I say, lack of knowledge, a lack of due diligence. If you look at Australia, it has always had its own set of challenges in relating to major powers in Asia, be this Japan or Indonesia, and even wartime China. A lot of us were not very familiar with that part of history, and that's really to our disadvantage. But nevertheless, in recent years, when folks in Canberra openly talk about making a choice between Washington, D.C. and Beijing, and that sort of reconfirmed a nightmarish scenario of Australia having no baggage of history. There is a difference here. We understand Japan or the Japanese society may have a baggage that's pulling itself back. It may not want to repeat the lesson, the history of war. But Australia and China never had any much of a territorial or war to each other. There is a sense that you would go theoretical all the way. We don't expect Australia to be able to pull itself back like some in Japan constantly remind themselves. We hear those voices in Japan, but in Australia, out of Australia, it's like, let's do it, let's do it, let's do it. And that reconfirms a nightmarish scenario of a country that can piggyback on the United States in some of these operations close to China, if you recall the Taiwan Straits or whatnot. And then it's a little bit far, frankly speaking, for us to hit back. What do you do?
Yeah.
So Australia, in that sense, is viewed with a sense of apprehension, if not fear. That's a point I don't think that often transcends. A lot of diplomats probably speak, or scholars, in other terms. But nevertheless, I would think there are ways to for us to put the relationship back into some balance if we had made a greater effort to relate to each other, to understand, for Chinese especially, Australia's search for security by looking at Australian versions of history of the Australian place in the universe. And then likewise, I would think the Australian side probably should have a lot more of talking to the Chinese rather than just about the Chinese. Thank you.
Yeah, we might pick up on some of those themes in the question and answer, but it's really interesting to get your perspective, particularly given what's happened over the last couple of months in the relationship. But I might turn to Huang now. We were talking about this before we went to air. I was very impressed that you made a prediction about international relations early on in the Trump administration, and you can declare now that it's come out as largely accurate. So congratulations. Your crystal ball gazing has been very impressive. But you did say at the start of the Trump administration that the relationship with Vietnam had the opportunity to improve despite, and you very diplomatically phrased this as Trump's unusual approach to managing international affairs, and that this is, a somewhat counterintuitive prediction, but one that seems to have sort of borne out over the last 3 years. So what I'm really curious to ask you about is this a consequence of Trump's own approach to international relations or his administration, or is the Trump administration building on progress that was already being made under the Obama administration? Is there something new going on, or is this really a continuation of an improvement in relations over time?
Yes, so the US-Vietnam relations had been on the rather positive trajectory for some time. And as I mentioned in the brief, the Obama's administration ended on very high note. So he visited Vietnam just a couple months before the end of his term. He was hugely, very warmly received in Vietnam, and he lifted the last part of the embargo. And that created the kind of momentum of and expectations that, and also, at that point, a lot of people would have bet their bets on Hillary Clinton winning the elections, and she was very clear in terms of her view on the South China Sea. So there was a lot of expectation going on. When Trump was elected, I think there was quite a lot of anxiety in Vietnam how to approach this new candidate and this new president, and what is his line of foreign policy. And as you mentioned, a lot of analysts think of him as unpredictable. But in a way, I think the Vietnamese came to deal with President Trump in a fairly successful way, as we assess it in the brief, particularly if you compare with the region. And it's not because it was very good, so let me rephrase, it's not very positive relationship, it's least bad compared to the region, I would say, particularly when you compare with partners and allies with much stronger relationship, defense relationship, and treaty allies like the Philippines or Thailand, or even partners like Singapore who had very strong already existing ties. Vietnam had a lot of room to improve. So therefore, the relativity is different. And also, I think Vietnam was very nervous and did early steps to mitigate those anxieties. So for example, Prime Minister Nguyễn Xuân Phúc was the first Southeast Asian leader to visit Trump's White House. He was only the third of the Asian leader to visit White House. He was very forward-leaning in terms to, assure Trump that Vietnam is taking steps to minimize the trade between, that's the sore point of Trump. And, you know, Vietnam also hosted the second Trump-Kim summit. So, and actually, President Trump in 2017 came to APEC, hosted in Vietnam in his first year of presidency. That hasn't happened for a long, long time, right? So effectively, during this presidency of Donald Trump, he visited Vietnam twice. So I think the only Southeast Asian country that he managed to visit twice had finished APEC summit. He did visit Manila, but left earlier on, and really didn't attend any regional summits afterwards. So for Vietnam, you know, had to have that attention of Trump was already seen as diplomatic success. The second point I would say, yes, I agree with you that there was already a momentum with or without Trump, which means the recognition of defense community on both sides, the security communities on both sides, that they are good partners for each other. And obviously China was the biggest point that joined the two. The biggest commonality right now is the China threat. This will be probably lasting for some time. I think the Vietnamese, quite like in the beginning, Trump's more open approach to China and willingness to call out China, including in the South China Sea coercions, but other issues as well. So that is something that stands out, especially in comparison, as I said, with the rest of the region. So if you look at, for example, regional surveys, regional studies comparing the entire Southeast Asia, Vietnamese perception of the US, even under Trump, is the most positive. Which is quite interesting. For example, I'll give you a quick number, which is, regionally, only across 10 Southeast Asian countries, a study done by a Singaporean think tank, were tested whether the US have still be playing a key security role in the region. A median of Southeast Asia, and only 32% of median Southeast Asian answered that, but Vietnamese responded only was 55. So in every question, Vietnam's view on US was significantly higher. So that was quite interesting. I will wrap it up because I know that we have more time for discussion, but obviously those perception were, and those analyses were before COVID. So we have to take some correction, you know, since COVID and after COVID, how that perception and views on the US will change. And I think they will to some degree. Some things won't change. I think the recognition of China threat won't change regardless of November elections results, but you know, maybe tactics and the way of treating China. So I think that commonality that I stressed between Vietnam and US being the perception of China threat is going to stay there. So there's still a lot of room to deepen and develop the partnership and the relationship between US and Vietnam. But I'll finally just end up on the note before taking too much time, is that there will be a lot of room for change as well, because the November election in the US, but also the upcoming Party Congress in Vietnam early 2021, where sort of the change of guard will happen and the new policies for the next 5 years will happen. I think the mega trend would be still very much willingness to cooperate and strong views on the US role, but a lot of details may change because we will have new at both administrations on both sides. And I'll leave it there.
Thank you. I mean, I just find it incredibly interesting, given the history between the United States and Vietnam, that this is where we've kind of landed in 2020. It's quite fascinating. And just before I turn to Nicole, would like your thoughts. You mentioned the South China Sea. Obviously, this is an interest that I have as well. So maybe I'm just being a little bit self-indulgent in asking you this at the moment. But have the Trump administration activities in this this domain. So the increased number and regularity of freedom of navigation operations. How have these been received in Vietnam? Do Vietnamese policymakers like these sorts of operations? Do they see them as stabilizing or destabilizing? Do they want the United States to involve itself more in these disputes?
Well, I think there are a number of issues that are considered rather positive. First of all, that South China Sea figures high in the Trump's administration's policy, which was in the beginning a concern that it won't, given how he started with the Korean Peninsula focus. But it has figured. The FONOPs themselves, yes, they are fine, but I don't think many in Hanoi would think it's sufficient. They were very happy to have several times the U.S. State Department very fast and quite explicit response to, for example, the Chinese activities in the South China Sea, incurring into Vietnamese exclusive economic zone, which Vietnam has protested, and the U.S. State Department was the only to come up with a very fast statement condemning the issues, and also explicitly saying that Vietnam has been, exercising its own rights in exploring the resources within its exclusive economic zone. So that was very well received. Whether this is enough or not, of course, there would be more expectation to do more. And there have been, of course, as well, recommendations for the US to do something about UNCLOS as well. So there are, of course, more things that Hanoi would expect or would wish the US could do. But I think the things that you've mentioned, the FONOPs and other things, are so far well received.
Before I turn to Nicole, I would just like to remind our audience that Slido is open for questions. If you have any issues getting your questions up, please feel free to email the team, and we've got the code behind us. And I see Diana has sent a message out through chat, and we've got some coming up at the moment. But Nicole, I'd like to turn to you. You told me before we started that you've bought a plant especially for this occasion. So thank you. It looks great in your background. And you've contributed to the policy brief on the Philippines. And, you know, one of the things that I'm really interested in is we know that President Rodrigo Duterte is quite a character himself, and was quite, I guess, suspicious or distrustful of Barack Obama. Didn't really like being lectured on things like human rights or rule of law. So I'm wondering, how has Duterte taken to Trump, and vice versa? Has Trump's sort of strongman leadership style emboldened Duterte's own authoritarian tendencies? And how has this played out in terms of the broader relationships in the region, given that Duterte also appears to be cultivating closer relationships with Beijing?
Yes, well, the relationship between President Duterte and President Trump appears to be congenial, if not affectionate. And I say this because President Duterte even serenaded President Trump in a gala dinner hosted by the Philippines, I think around 3 years ago. But yeah, you're right. What distinguishes President Trump from President Obama and actually other former US heads of state is that he did not press President Duterte about human rights abuses. So in that sense, Duterte got a free pass from the US. And my sense is this is also the same reason why President Duterte or the Duterte regime finds it convenient to build an economic relationship with Beijing, because it does not make this relationship conditional on whether the Philippines protects liberal values. But I guess my main contribution to this conversation is also to emphasize that the US approach to human rights goes beyond President Trump. So for example, there is the Global Magnitsky Human Rights and Accountability Act in the US. It's a bipartisan bill enacted by the Congress in 2016, which sanctions governments implicated in human rights abuses. And one of the subjects of the Magnitsky Act is no other than Senator De La Rosa, who was a former police chief and chief architect of Duterte's drug war. And his visa to travel to the US was revoked. And so this ignited President Duterte's order to terminate a critical military agreement with the United States. And as a footnote, this order for termination of the military agreement is currently frozen. So I think just days before the Trobe Asia brief was about to get published, I had to send a panicked email just because of an about face in this termination of the agreement. But the point I wish to emphasize, I guess, in conclusion, is that pressure points for the Philippines to respect human rights may not necessarily come from President Trump, but it may come from other sources in the United States.
It's always risky writing about politics when everything seems to be changing.
Exactly. I had to check before going on Zoom this afternoon if it changed again.
That's right. But you end your contribution to the policy brief with a really interesting observation that the Philippines has been a steady supplier of nurses to the United States, with over 150,000 Filipino nurses migrating to the US since the 1960s. And you suggest it is not an overstatement to say that Filipinos are frontliners in America's COVID crisis, and that, and I'm quoting you, the empire wants the Philippines back. So I'm really curious to ask, I'm really interested to know what you mean by that statement, but also about this question of what the COVID crisis has meant for Philippine relations with US, and how it might sort of determine the future trajectory of relations between the US and Philippines.
So I wasn't being rhetorical when I used the word empire in the title of my piece, The Empire Wants You Back. I think the term empire actually puts a spotlight on the material and cultural relations between the US and the Philippines, and how these relationships are not static, but constantly negotiated and redrawn. And I think the experience of both countries in COVID-19 is an example. So as you mentioned, my contribution talks about how the US health system is kept together by a steady supply of nurses from the Philippines. And there's a lot of excellent work on this topic. The book Empire of Care by Catherine Choi is an example. And the message is that the nurse migration to the US is not simply a reaction to the shortage of healthcare workers in America, but it's deeply rooted in US colonialism in the Philippines. So for example, the institutionalization of nursing training programs was actually part of the American colonial project of training Filipino women to be ready to be exported to the US because of their English speaking skills, their docility, their obedience. And on the part of the nurses, there's an idealization of the US as a destination for professional growth and lifestyle aspirations. So here we're talking about the American dream. And it's precisely this culture, I think, that Filipino healthcare workers are among the most vulnerable frontliners in COVID-19 in the US, as well as in the UK, if you look at the death rates of frontliners dying of COVID. And because the reason for that is because Filipino nurses are considered sacrificial lambs, the heroic staff who go to work even without proper PPEs, and they could easily lose their jobs or get punished if they speak up and complain of not having the proper protective equipment. So this is very much part of the model migrant myth of Filipino migrant workers. So why does this matter when we talk about security and Trump in Asia? I think this is part of a broader conversation about the untapped power of a seemingly insignificant nation like the Philippines when it comes to global crises. It's not just a case of big powers taking advantage of the Philippines' diasporic population when they need it. But I think it's also a matter of how diasporic countries like the Philippines can reshape critical institutions like healthcare systems in the US, Australia, and even Canada. And I think the reshaping of relations needs to have this, I suppose, interracial, transnational character with other migrant groups asserting the right of migrant care workers in the health sector. And I guess just as a footnote, of course, we know that President Trump has recently issued a directive canceling work visas for a lot of migrant workers. And one of the exceptions, or actually when COVID happened, one of the biggest announcements of the US Embassy is that if you have healthcare training, you can jump the queue, you can actually apply for a visa now. So in a way, we can see the very transactional character of the Trump regime, not only on the level of government elites, but also on the level of the people. So I think when we think about US-Philippine relations, it's not a one-way power relationship. There has to be a realization of power in political economy terms, that the Philippines actually is not a small nation when it comes to issues like COVID-19, given that Filipino frontliners are all over the world.
Yeah, it's fascinating to hear you speak on this topic. And I think that you're right that in sort of typical international security conversations, we don't often talk about these sorts of issues. So it's really interesting to hear that perspective. We do have questions coming in thick and fast. So we are turning to audience Q&A. So please write your question using www.slido.com, and don't forget to like questions. I see somebody has just written in the chat. Please use the Slido rather than the chat function to ask your question. I am going to start with a broad question that's just popped up from our friend at Asia Link, Melissa Conley-Tyler. Hi, Melissa. Thank you for watching. I'm going to ask each of the panelists, and I'll start with Dao Zhang. This is the question. In the La Trobe Asia brief, Nick Bisley says, under Trump, US-Asia strategy has been incoherent. So one of our other contributors, who will be doing a podcast with La Trobe Asia in a couple of weeks on this topic, has described US-Asia strategy as incoherent. So she wants to know, do the speakers agree? And have there been any pockets of coherence in the approach? So I'll start with Dao Zhang. What's your opinion on this? Has the Asia strategy of the US been incoherent?
I see more continuity in US-Asia strategy. In terms of military arrangement, there had never been many fundamental changes, and the U.S. stays as the I wouldn't say unchallenged, but sometimes the Chinese try to challenge a little bit, but it's the unrivaled power. And in terms of economics, the U.S. would like to trade and investment, but when it feels there are serious challenges, it used to have these problems with Japan. Now they have similar problems in the trade with China. But the trade curbs or the tariffs is only part of the picture. The U.S. would still like to come and invest here in China innovation. So I don't really see there is much of a real change. And in the cultural terms, earlier Nicole made a good point about how they treat frontline health workers and whatnot. And coupled with the recent events within the U.S. itself, with the race-based, should we say, demonstrations or whatnot. There's a good deal of continuity. I wouldn't think there's a lot of change.
So I might get Huang to intervene now in this conversation, because as somebody who managed to sort of predict parts of improving relations, do you agree? Do you think that there are parts that there are coherent parts to Trump's Asia strategy, and that that might come from having a more transactional approach to managing international affairs?
I probably wouldn't attribute everything, the elements that I would argue that are coherent or continuous, to Trump himself. I think a lot of that is foreign policy and defense establishment that have been carrying on along the work and manage not to have as much disruption. For example, the trajectory of Vietnam relations that I've just talked about is largely it's continued and it's promoted by the Indo-PACOM, by Admiral Phil Davidson had made several trips to the region, including to Vietnam. Increasingly, the Indo-Pacific strategy did mention Vietnam among the key partners. So I think there are elements that are continuous and probably will continue unless they get disruption from Trump. And in one of my argumentation, I think Vietnam is small enough so that it doesn't attract as much Trump's attention, and therefore it can carry on with the line that, like I said, the foreign policy and the State Department and Defense Department would wish it to be. Trump did refer to Vietnam as the worst abuser of all, but you know, it is something, it's just rhetorical. Incoherence, there are those are elements of coherence and more continuous. Of course, there are many that are for us analysts seem incoherent and counterintuitive. For example, how he treats long-term allies, which is arguably the biggest US strength. So Vietnam is not in that basket. That's why it manages to get away with a lot. But to the broader argument that Nick made, whether, you know, Asia is less secure because of Trump, I don't think Trump can also take the whole credit for that, because the general strategic environment, and we have other actors, not to mention, for example, Chinese activities in the South China Sea, but also Taiwan and others, can also take a lot of credit for changing its strategic environment. So yes, there are parts of that we can put on the Trump's unusual conduct of foreign policy and relations with the actors in the region, but I don't think he can really take the whole credit for that.
Fair enough. And I think that the point that you make is really important. There is a risk in this kind of activity of just talking about Trump that we place too much emphasis on leadership and personalities, and trying to draw out the relationships between who's in charge and the institutions that are important for defence and foreign policy. And that's really something that we need to do. So I might turn to Nicole. What's your thoughts on this issue? Is Nick right? Has the US-Asia strategy been incoherent in your view?
I will echo what you said. We have to make a distinction between the personalities and the institutions. So for example, when President Duterte on a whim said he would like to cancel a military agreement with the US, President Trump just said, great, it will save us a lot of money, which is very much consistent to an America First approach, very nationalist, inward looking rather than reaching out to the region. But then if we look at this on the level of institutions, when, for example, the armed forces of the Philippines put forward their position on the matter, they actually wanted to keep this agreement because they want to keep that interoperability working, not just in relation to having a consistent policy in fighting insurgency in southern Philippines and extremism, but also when it comes to disaster preparedness. So it's always the United States that responds first, whether it's a typhoon or an earthquake, although it's quite peculiar how the US is no longer viewed to be the first savior in a way of a former colony during the pandemic, because obviously, I guess they have their own problems to deal with. But I guess this is the point that's important to underscore. I agree with my co-panelists that we can see a lot of continuity, especially if we go beyond the rhetoric. The relationship predominantly still remains the same. We cannot dismantle a long history of joint military exercises, of joint intelligence operations, just because we have very mercurial presidents from both countries.
Yeah, I think issues of path dependence are important here as well, that there are these long histories of relations and interoperability and those sorts of issues that make it difficult even for, a president to try to untangle those webs of relations. So thanks for that question, Melissa. I hope Nick is watching at home as we pull apart his argument. But I might turn to the next question, which is actually about India. So I might pass this one on to you, Dao Jung, if you don't mind, because it's about the present situation on the border between India and China. And we do have a contribution in the policy brief from Tanvi Madan, who talks about US-India relations, and we're doing a podcast with her next week. But I'm curious, Dao Jung, how much can India rely upon the United States with Trump as president? And this question is coming from Canada. And do you see, whether India's reliance on the United States will change under a Biden government? But if you could give us some insights also on the India-China relationship at the moment, I think that would be much appreciated.
Actually, by coincidence, I was just joining a webinar last night with colleagues based in New Delhi. We were discussing, no, the webinar makes things happen almost instantaneously. We were talking about the Indian decision to ban some of these Chinese apps sold by Chinese companies in that country, and other related issues. Now, the border incident is I don't know how to describe it, but the end result is it gets a lot more attention in India than it does here in China. But let's not forget, the Indian foreign policy has its own strengths. It's probably, India has traditionally been the only country of its size, the only major country, regardless of level of development, regardless of its military capacity, to truly keep an equal distance with all the major powers. India does not go with anyone. And in many ways, this should be a model for Chinese foreign policy. That is to say, you deal with each and every country with, keep everyone at arm's length. I don't think this goes back to Nehru or before Nehru. And I think Indians, that tradition of Indian foreign policy can continue. I wouldn't think the US is going to have much of a chance in affecting a change, especially given that China has changed in many ways, and many Indians elites are convinced of the Chinese change, of not siding with Pakistan on some of the geostrategic issues with India. So you should hear China keep more of a balance between India and Pakistan. I thought that's probably what it is, and hope chances are there will be a telephone call at the highest level of the two governments in a few days in relation to the border situation. But I don't think that quote unquote Indian reliance on the US was ever an option in the first place. India does not rely on anyone. And it's good. It's good.
That's really, that's interesting to hear your thoughts on that issue. We do have a couple of other China-related questions, but I might throw to Huang. Hunter Marsden, hi Hunter, has a question about China's response to COVID-19 and how that has affected its image in Southeast Asia, and how do regional states view United States and Chinese assistance and competition for influence. So I might start with Huang, and then I'll ask Nicole to comment on that question as well.
Hi, Hunter. You would know that Southeast Asia is very diverse and have very different views, wouldn't you? And, I'm not sure if I'm the best person to say to talk about how China responded. I can talk about how the regional voices and regional perceptions of how China deal with it. I think it's a mixed, some have expressed opinion that in the beginning it looked really scary, but China had been able to come around and seems to be in control. Very soon it started to provide the PPEs, the mask, and roll out the so-called mass diplomacy. That resonated to some, but not all. And it didn't also, it didn't roll out to everyone. I think, for example, my colleagues in Malaysia have raised a number of cases, but it wasn't so much the same in Vietnam, for example, right? And the views have been different, and now we potentially are facing the second wave or more and beyond, so we are far from really having the full picture and having, sort of decisive opinions on that. What is rather consistent is the view on US though. So US have provided a number of sums of monetary assistance to the region, which is less well known to the public, but not so much in terms of providing masks and PPEs, for example. In fact, it was Vietnam who sent a lot of masks and PPEs to the United States, and also both in terms of donation as well as normal trade. So that was quite a shocking moment for not only the two countries' history, but also for the region. I think, like I said in the opening remarks, it comes like a shock for many in the region. I think globally as well, but particularly in Southeast Asia, that used to think that US, was so taken aback by this virus and pandemic, and is not dealing very well. So that certainly has and probably will continue to impact on the perception of power, control, and governance of the US.
So, I mean, there's some really interesting points to be made there. And Nicole, I would like your perspective on this issue around, China's response to COVID and how you see this as affecting, Southeast Asian states and relations with China and also the United States.
So President Duterte's close relationship with China has actually become one of the wedges that divides the Duterte administration from the opposition. And one of the biggest critiques now against President Duterte is the preferential treatment that he gives to Chinese interests in relation to the handling of the pandemic. So for example, the Philippines did not close its borders right away because it did not want to stop Chinese tourists and investors from coming in the Philippines, even though everyone knows that the virus is actually already taken off in China. One of the first industries that were allowed to open after the lockdown or the semi-lockdown was an online gambling operation that serves Chinese clients. And all of these have become rallying cries for opposition figure to say, this is what happens with a very powerful China and a subservient government that prioritizes them first. And even though China did provide what Huang was talking about in terms of mass diplomacy, there are a lot of critics of the president who also uses this kind of diplomacy to discredit this kind of approach of China in terms of giving aid. So for example, there have been critiques of flawed PPEs, flawed masks, fake tests, linking it back to China. So I think my personal worry here as a sociologist is how this virus has actually inflamed more racial tensions between Filipinos and Chinese people. It has been accused, for example, I'm not sure how it's like in other Southeast Asian countries, but the concept of the Wuhan virus has taken off in the Philippines as well. So this is part, I guess, of the long resentment that some Filipinos have against Chinese nationals in the country who have taken jobs away from them and now taken even more jobs from them because of the virus. So yeah, so I think that's how I would interpret how Filipinos receive China's power in relation to this pandemic. It's being used as a critique to a president who until now is still very popular.
Fascinating. So I might, we've got a few minutes for questions. I might turn the conversation back to you, Dao Zhang, because we have a question from Rowan Kallick, who I understand is somebody that you know quite well and is on our advisory board. Hi, Rowan. Thank you for tuning in. And he wants to know how Xi Jinping has adapted his security or economic strategies to accommodate Trump. Especially relating to trade deal lapses due to COVID. So has China's administration, I guess, altered its policy directions due to the Trump administration being in power in the United States?
That's a very tough question. I was in some ways involved in a lot of those discussions, so there are too many details that can, we can talk about. But I don't think there was that much a meeting of mind between China and the United States, even with the agreement. Because if you look at the purchase, the numerical, the targets of procurement, these were put down in dollar terms. And look, prices change. And it is simply mind-boggling how the negotiators ever agreed on that. If you look at the trade relationship, in the end, it's the effort you make. And I don't really think the Chinese have really figured out leadership, how to quote unquote deal effectively with Mr. Trump or a US presidency. Very much like the United States, the criticism against Trump administration. We here in China should have pursued trade agreements, better trade deals with EU, with Australia, with Southeast Asia as a counterbalance to the kind of bilateral pressure that came from Washington, D.C. But we didn't. And so I think history will come back to offer its assessment. But at the end of the day, what saves the economic relationship between China and the United States, or China, Australia, for that matter, China, Vietnam, or China, Philippines, is actually human ingenuity in the domestic economies, rather than these trade deals one way or another. With or without a trade deal, people even smuggle if there is a need. So it's really how you actually organize production and trade within your border. That's really the fundamental thing.
Just briefly, the highest rated question just before we wrap up is for you, Daojia, is about China's policies in relation to Xinjiang in Hong Kong. How are these human rights issues affecting China's relationships with the United States, but also more broadly in the region?
We are not very familiar with what's really going on in Xinjiang. There is a blind spot for me to admit. I don't really know. Even though I'm a professor in a fairly well-funded university. And given the history of how such matters are handled, I would think in the end, it's some equitable level of treatment, some level of access to education, access to employment. We don't, even though, I don't, maybe Ms. Huang can tell us, here is those countries that followed the Soviet tradition had a long history of, separating their own people according to different so-called ethnicities. We have 56 here in China. We don't really think that a way out of this is to claim difference, and be hell splitting. There has to be going in the direction of more of a common template. So I've traveled to Xinjiang before, but I don't know what's really going on and what really exactly got the Americans so excited. There is a blind spot, frankly speaking. Now about Hong Kong, I actually used to teach different courses, teach courses. We have students coming from Hong Kong who take courses on a regular basis. It's about time for the violence to stop. There has to be a way. You can never justify a pursuit in any name when you shut down the airport, when you shut down the train station, when you harass innocent passengers, and when you have airline stewardesses or the pilots being so active in political movement. That's a risk. There has to be stopped.
Thank you for providing that kind of perspective on these issues. It's quite insightful. But I would like to, we've only got 2 minutes, so one sentence each. I want to ask one final question, and I will start with Nicole. Would you like to see a government change in November in the United States? Can you give us a Philippines perspective, a Huang? Can you give us a Vietnamese perspective, and Daojia, a Chinese perspective on whether or not you want to see a change in government in November? So Nicole?
As a citizen and a private individual, absolutely yes. As a sociologist, what I would say is that Filipinos are actually Trump voters in the United States, Philams in particular, and the Filipinos love America more than Americans love America. That's based on a recent poll. So what I would say is, even if Trump wins again, he has a base among Filipino Americans. So I'll just leave that there with no further normative judgment.
Thank you. Huong, I might turn to you. What's Vietnam wanting?
Well, I don't think any from the Vietnamese government would want to answer that question, giving very ASEAN way of non-interference, and specifically not publicly speaking. I can't even speak for the Vietnamese government either, as a private academic based in Canberra, but. I would say that on one hand, I think I would assume that people in Hanoi are sort of getting a way to understand Trump. So change might have to enforce a new learning and a new person in charge. But I think above most, I think the Vietnamese policymakers would want to see a strong America. In order for America to play more global and regional role, and we do need leadership and good governance for whomever, and America is among those countries. I think everyone wants to see a strong America, and whoever it is, whether Trump, which is question mark, or any other person, I think that's what ultimately the Vietnamese government would want, a strong America that is interested in the region and interested in being in the region.
And finally, well, to end the evening, the fascinating discussion, China, is it looking forward to another 4 years of Trump, or would it like to see Biden in the White House?
Personally, I think Trump is better. Okay, he's transparent. He treats, he talks, and he gives you warning when he is going to deliver something. And he has a network of associates whose behaviors are predictable. And, you know, but on the other hand, in terms of government policy, I think both over there in the United States, here in China, the agreement is to stay out of each other's mess. On a more serious note, I would think come November, whoever gets elected in or out of office, there should be more of a continuity in American high level, when I'm talking about presidential level, presence at these regional meetings, such as APEC, such as the East Asian Forum, because that's one way to give everyone a sense of assurance that there's normalcy. So I think that's probably what the last thing that we would want to see is some more chaotic situation here among 8 different Asian countries, because that would be a lot more consequential.
Thank you to our panelists. I think it's been a remarkably interesting, fascinating conversation with diverse points of view, coming at things from an economic, political and sociological perspective. I've learnt a lot, and thank you also to the audience for watching this La Trobe Asia event. This is not the only event that we are holding to launch our Trump in Asia policy brief. La Trobe Asia's Matt Smith will be hosting live Asia Rising podcasts with some of the other contributors, beginning with Tanvi Madan from the Brookings Institution on July 7th at 10 a.m. Melbourne time. And they'll be discussing the relationship between India and the United States under the Trump administration. So this webinar has been recorded. If you have registered for this event, you will be emailed the appropriate links when they are ready, and we will also include links to the policy brief. So please follow us on Twitter at La Trobe Asia, or join our mailing list to find more details for online events and La Trobe Asia publications. Thank you again.
Thank you. Bye-bye.